My jaw dropped. I was like, Wilkinson? And he was like, yeah. I was like, the drum and bass guy? He was like, yeah. I was like, hi, I'm Becky Hill, and this is the story behind Afterglow. I remember starting to fall in love with music around the age of 9 and 10. I did my first live performance when I was 11. I remember my parents sat in the audience, and they still tell the story today where I started singing Jojo, Get Out, Leave. Such a big tune. All the other parents were turning around to my mum and dad and being like, how did you guys know about this? And they were like, we had no idea. I was always quite secretive with it, I guess. But I started falling in love with dance music in particular due to my big brother Adam. I remember hearing Creeper by DJ Zinc and Dynamite through my brother's door. And I remember sat outside my brother's door listening to the whole thing. I must have been about 12. My brother always told me to wait until I was 18 to go raving properly. He was like, any younger and it'll ruin your experience. Now, half of me agrees with that. Half of me would have loved to have gone raving at 15 years old. But I actually waited, and I went to arguably one of the best clubs in the country in particular, but one of the best clubs I've been to, and that is Fabric. And I went to a players' night, and it was Original Sin and Taxman. And I remember walking down the stairs of Fabric and going, I am home. I knew that I had found a calling of love for music and rave culture.
This ain't a movie, no fairy tale conclusion, gets more confusing every day.
So The Voice came along for me at a time in my life where I had experienced my first bout of depression. I was at a crossroads in my life, whether to do my A-levels and go to university, which frightened the hell out of me. I was in a little band, and we did open mics and we did gigs around the local area. The Voice was recommended to me by somebody I'd met on the open mic circuit, and I went through onto the internet and applied, and the next thing I knew I was writing down lyrics on the train to Birmingham. And I remember getting into the hall where they were calling numbers, and there were people like off in corners warming up and singing songs, and I remember thinking, what the fuck am I doing here? I have never done a YouTube video. I've never, been that forward facing. I've always been quite shy about the way that I look. And that was half of the attraction to The Voice. I was convinced that they wouldn't see my face, and I think that was half of the attraction of going. And honestly, it came at a time of my life that I needed something, and I had the time of my life. I was in a writing session with Brad Ellis, who you'll know from The Next Men, and Talay Riley, and we were writing a really bad song for me. Like, it was terrible. We got to the end of writing the song, and Brad had a phone call. And he took the phone call, and he put the phone down. And he went, Wilkinson wants to send me over a beat. My jaw dropped. I was like, Wilkinson? And he was like, yeah. I was like, the drum and bass guy? He was like, yeah. I was like, and I remember sat in session being like, oh my God, I love his shit. He sent the beat over. Brad started doing the piano, dun, 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 dun. And Talay was like, I've got an idea. He was like, Afterglow. And I went, great, what does it mean? And he was like, I have no idea. And we Googled it and we found out the meaning of Afterglow, and I was like, this is perfect. This is such a sick song concept. What do you feel in a rave? Well, it's like smoke and lasers, love and ravers, Afterglow. We were like, this is wicked. And we just we wrote it again in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and it kind of wrote itself, that one. again, I listen to that record and I think, God, how young I am. I'm probably just turned 19. I was pretty much fresh off The Voice. It wasn't a very cool thing to be on anyway. Talent shows never really are. And I really thought about Wilkinson's career and how I'd seen how cool I thought he was as a listener to drum and bass and as a raver. And I made the call to not put my name on that record because I didn't want people to think he had sold out. I kept my name off that record and I had no idea. It went to number 8 in the UK charts. I knew it may have had a bit of a thing at the time, but I had no idea that for 11 years it would be regarded as one of the most classic, iconic drum and bass records of all time. I think everyone knows that's my record now, as much as it is his. I think the whole battle throughout my entire career has been getting people to recognise that these songs are as much mine as they are the other artists, and they've come from my own brain and they've come from my own throat. And now it's beautiful to have that recognition. People know that record as my record, and I'm very grateful for people to see that I'm not just a vocalist that wrote a little song over a drum and bass record. I love it. I love drum and bass, and I love dance music across the board. I remember meeting Andy C for the first time and running in. He just played Afterglow and it hadn't been released. And this was at Global Gathering. And I remember running into his dressing room, knocked on, and I was just like, oh my God, Andy, I love you so much. And you could see his face being like, get this groupie out my room now. And I went, oh, sorry, I wrote Afterglow. And he was like, oh, come on in, do you want a drink? I still get a little bit like that now. I have to remind myself of who I am and what I do.
Radio 1 and online in the Live Lounge. Wilkinson, take it away.
I remember that Live Lounge. I was so nervous. This is when Fern Cotton still did Live Lounge on Radio 1. And I remember going in there, again, really green 19-year-old, and I remember how nervous I felt. And we were doing a drum and bass version of Counting Stars by One Republic and doing Afterglow as well. And I remember Mark pressed it and it started and then it stopped and then it crashed. I just worked myself up to be able to sing live on radio. And I've been listening to Live Lounges since I was younger as well. So like this was and it still is a huge deal. He fucked it up. And we had to start again. And I just remember being terrified. And it was almost like once we got that fuck up out the way, I calmed down a bit then and was able to focus on what we were doing.
We're ready for the sun, pull the sunlight back.
I went to New Zealand for the first time in January, and I just didn't have to sing any of it. It was lovely to have that engagement, and I get that all over the UK, and it was so nice to go 23 hours across the world and have that same response in New Zealand as well. To see the power of that record now, 11 years later, is incredible.